Nikki Pasqual is with Pasqual Ross Public Affairs, and she works with CFILC in helping us with some of our communications. And so we would come and share some of her knowledge and expertise about really good communications. And she's not only brought her expertise about communications, but she's also been with us through several trainings and some refinements that we've done specifically around Olmstead and disability. And so she's really been able to tailor the presentation a bit to be really most useful for us. Nikki has a decade of experience serving progressive elected officials at the federal, state, and local levels. She's a former communications and legislative aide to Treasurer Angelides and Deputy Communications Director and Policy Advisor for Lieutenant Governor John Garamendi. She holds a bachelor's degree in political science from UC Berkeley and a master's in public policy and administration from CSU Sacramento. So we are delighted to have Nikki with us, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Nikki. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you everyone who's joining today. I'm grateful for the opportunity to work with CFILC and to be a part of your Olmstead effort. As Laurel mentioned, I spent the early part of my career in government, and I'm now doing consulting with my clients being primarily organizations who are advocating for strong health and human services and particularly funding those services through the state budget. So I have had some experience with some of your issues, but I do really encourage your input and your questions as we go along, since you are the policy experts, and I'm really interested in your insight and your participation today. So to start, I was hoping maybe we could use the hand raising feature of the webinar here, and if folks could raise their hand if you've had experience being interviewed by the media or putting on an event for the media, and we can kind of get an assessment of where people are in their experience. Looks like we have a few folks. A couple of folks. So I did want to start the presentation today. There's going to be two parts really, and one is a really kind of an introductory set of slides on the media and working with the media and particularly advocacy opportunities for folks who are advancing policy issues. And that, I think, is important really, because when we get to the messaging area, it's important to understand the media context that we're working in. Drawing attention to our issues isn't always easy, particularly in California. It's a big state, a lot going on politically, and so I just want to go over some background on kind of what the media is looking for, so that when we get to the part of messaging, we can be sensitive to that and really look for good opportunities. And then the second part of the presentation will be really digging our teeth in a little bit on creating messages, and we're going to start by looking at messages that advocates are using, thinking about what's in a good message, and then doing an exercise to create a message specifically around Olmstead and policy issues. So I'm going to the slide on, this is slide 15, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about why we try to communicate with the media. And obviously, a lot of our groups are looking to get media coverage so that we can build support for policy changes, build support for funding services that are important to our communities, to motivate leaders to take action around issues that are important to us, or to maybe change a debate when we don't really feel that our leaders are giving enough attention to an issue. And I'll just give an example of why I think this is important. If we think about the recent debate in Congress over the debt ceiling, you'll see that a lot of the media coverage was really about jobs and the economy, and thinking about why how the decisions the Congress made over the debt ceiling were related to jobs, whereas a lot of, I think, advocates that I work with felt that that was the way that it was presented in the media was sort of a false choice, that the long-term issues were really secondary to kind of the crisis that people are experiencing right now. And so that's a way where you can see that the way that the media presents an issue can really determine the outcome. And so that's why we want to be engaged with the media and ensuring that our side of the story is told. So I'm going to go along to slide 16. And this is really just a recap of different ways that people will try to get their message out through the media. And there are different ways that we do that, and usually a campaign around an issue or and kind of an advocacy plan to advance legislation or to secure funding for an important service will use a combination of all of these things. So the various ways that we might want to get a message out would include sending out a press release, pitching a story to a particular reporter. If you know that there is a newspaper reporter or a TV reporter or a blogger, for example, that has shown interest in an issue, you might want to approach them and really walk them through our message and the facts that back up that message. Then we might want to hold an event. You'll see I work here in Sacramento, right across the street from the Capitol, and almost every day there are advocates here holding events on the Capitol steps around all sorts of issues. So that's a common tool that advocates use, and one that you really have to do really well in order to get attention here, because there really are quite a few. Next we have writing an op-ed, which you'll see in newspaper. This will be when a person who doesn't work for the newspaper presents their opinion on something, and that's a way that groups and organizations will often use to lay out their perspective on an issue that's being debated, or to try to raise an issue that maybe hasn't gotten a lot of attention. And then, of course, there's all of the online tools that people are probably familiar with on this call: blogs, using a website, using the social media tools like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, etc. So the next slide, we're going to talk about what's in a good news story. And this is, I think, important when we're talking about developing our messaging and developing a communication plan, to think about when we approach the media and want them to write a story that presents our issue. We really want to make sure that we have all of the pieces in hand, and that's going to really increase our likelihood of getting a favorable story, or making sure that the media understands our side of the issue. And so if you think about when you read a newspaper story or you see a news story on TV, they usually have, ideally all of these components, or at least the majority of them. So the story will often start with a first-hand account of someone who is affected by an issue. Then it'll usually give a sense of the scale of the issue. How many people are affected? How many people are served by a program that is slated to be cut, for example? And then ideally, we want there'll be quotes in the story. Oftentimes, a news reporter will present both sides. So there'll be quotes for someone who is, for example, trying to get a bill passed, and then there'll be a quote from an opponent to that bill. And so the quote is really our opportunity as communicators to get exactly the message we want in the story. It's not filtered. I mean, it's not written by the reporter. So that's 1 or 2 sentences where we want to present our message in the best light and have it coming from someone who is a trusted expert or someone who has a personal experience with the issue. And then we always want to, particularly for when we're talking about stories that have a statewide impact. So it might be a statewide policy, it might be a ballot initiative. When a reporter in, say, Fresno is writing a story about a issue on the national scale or the state scale, they're really going to try to give it some local color. And so that might be a local person who is an advocate on the issue. It might be a local person who is affected by a policy. And that's something that when we're approaching reporters to write stories on our issues, it's often good to have a person lined up from that area that can be a spokesperson. And then lastly, we want to have compelling visuals. And what I like to advise folks when they're putting together an event is to think about if you're watching a news story that night on TV and you turned off the volume on the TV, would the image that you see really tell the story? So that's why it's important when we have events that there be good signage, good visuals that make the story interesting enough for the TV reporter to want to come and cover the event, and also make it understandable to someone who's not familiar with the issue if they are only able to watch it for a few seconds. Does anyone have any questions up until this point? I can take them over the phone, or you can type
if you're on the phone, press *6 to unmute your line and ask a question.
All right, I don't hear any questions and I don't see any online. So I'm going to go ahead and move to slide 18. But if folks want to ask a question by chat or by phone, I'll definitely want to make time to answer those. I know there's probably folks have a different range of experience. So I don't want to spend too much time if people are feel like they have all this
Nikki,
down.
we do have one question from Sherry. Do you see it?
I do see. To improve the chances of getting an op-ed, should you have a pre-contact with the media contact? It definitely helps if you have a relationship and a direct connection. Really, I think in terms of the op-ed, what's really generally what the editors, newspaper editors, are looking for is kind of an unusual perspective on the issue. They don't necessarily want to repeat the same things that have been in the news pages. So, they do want to look for people that that might be present a new perspective to readers, present a different perspective than what's already been covered. And I'm definitely able to help. I'm going to give my contact information at the end of the session, and you'll have it in the PowerPoint. I'm definitely able to help take a look at op-eds. it really depends. During the legislative season, for example, I know we've been pitching op-eds for clients, and because there's so many people trying to get bills passed in the last 3 weeks of the session, the op-ed editors have been really underwater. It doesn't hurt to call ahead and say, hey, I'm thinking about writing an op-ed on a particular bill or an issue, or but oftentimes they'll say, I want to take a look at it, if that makes sense. But I definitely can help to take a look and give suggestions if that's helpful, and I'll share my contact information at the end. Let's see, there's another question here. I wonder about press releases. They seem to have a limited value, at least in our small community. Any thoughts? I think that usually when we have, when you are presenting an event, for example, it's always good to have a press release, because when you approach a reporter, they do want to generally have something in hand, something that they can kind of look at and assess, how big is this, and really is this news? And so for that reason, I think it's always good to do a press release. Now, it's generally not enough to just email press releases out broadly. You really generally need to follow up with a phone call to reporters, but they do generally want to have something in hand. So it's a good way to start to kind of make the introduction to the reporter, and it's also a good way, put it up on your website, maybe email it out to your community might have an interest. I wouldn't put, don't put a lot of time into writing a 3 or 4 page long press release, but I think it is good to have something in hand when you're going to approach reporters, but don't think that that's necessarily enough.
As you speak about it, Nikki, I'm thinking, it seems like in the way you're describing it, I've never thought about it before, but it's sort of like your resume. It credentials you, it covers the basics, and you need it to start the conversation, but it's only one piece of the process.
Exactly. And it really, it kind of depends. If you live in and you're working in Los Angeles and you email a press release to the LA Times, the likelihood of someone picking that up and writing a front page news story on it is probably pretty small, just because they're getting probably thousands of press releases every day. But they're definitely more useful in for example, approaching a local online news outlet, which may just reprint your press release as their news story. So it really depends on who you're targeting, and definitely it's a first step. It's not the only thing you want to do when you're doing outreach. So I'm going to go ahead and move on, and we'll definitely make time for more questions if that works for everyone.
Great.
So I'm on slide 18, and just talking about what's in a communications plan. Like we talked about earlier, you're going to want to probably use a variety of tools and strategies when you're trying to draw attention to an issue. And you want to think about, obviously, what do you want to achieve? And you want to develop a plan around that. So if your goal is, for example, to get a bill passed in the legislature, you're going to want a plan that carries you through the legislative cycle, and look ahead for what are going to be the immediate opportunities. So natural hooks might be when a bill is about to have a hearing, for example. When a bill is on the governor's desk, when there are actions that are going to be taken, or when there are, think about if you're going to wanting to pass legislation around schools or college issues. Back to school is a natural time when a lot of people will look for something that's interesting that's happening, or kind of a natural tie-in to draw the reporter's interest. You might want to think about holidays. Oftentimes we talk about, I've done some work, for example, with one of the Central Coast Center for Independent Living and their program for traumatic brain injury in veterans. And so obviously Veterans Day is a time when newspapers and online reporters and radio reporters are looking to do stories about veterans. So you want to look for kind of timelines that make sense in terms of the issue. And then you want to think about your target audience and really what are the news outlets that are going to draw their attention, whether they're geographical, whether they're online versus television. And oftentimes folks want to collect kind of the clips at the end and use that as an advocacy tool. So if you've gotten 15 stories about people that are affected by a policy or whose lives can be improved if a policy were adopted, and then you want to take those when you're doing meetings in the Capitol, then it makes sense to have stories from the the newspapers that of the legislators that you're targeting. So you want to think about kind of what you want to have in hand at the end, and then make a plan that works for that outcome. Just reading a question here. There's another question here. I think I'm going to, if it's okay, this is from Kim Katria, and I think this might make more sense to answer later in the presentation. So if that's okay, I'm going to table that for right now and come back to it a little bit later.
That's fine.
Okay. So now on to slide 19. We already kind of talked about this in terms of the press release, but you want to, I think Laurel made a great point that it is kind of a resume. It's just going to be an overview, and that you're going to want to use it as a tool to open conversations with reporters. So it ought to tell the story in a brief way and give facts and quotes that back up the argument that you're presenting. So I'll go ahead and to the next slide. And components of event, similarly, we talked about just kind of what is going to make your event attractive for the media. And it's a challenge because you could have the greatest event in the world, the greatest agenda, the greatest message, a great lineup of speakers, great visuals. But if the media doesn't show up to cover the event, then oftentimes people feel like they've put a lot of effort into something that didn't produce the result that you want. So these are kind of a checklist of things you can think about that reporters are looking for when they decide what stories they're going to cover that day. And again, this is going to vary by geography. For example, in downtown Los Angeles, there are reporters are getting hit up by a lot more people on different issues compared to, say, Fresno. Just a matter of how many outlets there are and how many news cameras they have, and similar with newspaper reporters. In some cities, the newspaper staff has really dwindled. Here in Sacramento, for example, the reporters from across the state that cover the Capitol have, in just a few years, it's down to half or even less of the number that was here 5 years ago. So it's really a kind of a challenge oftentimes in terms of getting attention from reporters that are stretched very thin. So you want to make sure, for example, that you're really making news, and that means presenting something that is new, is is influencing a debate, is showing a side of an issue that hasn't been shown before in kind of a unique way, something that's going to change the outcome of a decision. Similarly, teeing off the news cycle. You want to kind of be sure that when you're presenting an issue, whether you're writing a press release or having an event, this goes for kind of all of the tools in your communications toolkit. You want to make sure that you kind of understand what's already been reported on that issue and what is the new element that you're bringing. Because if you call a reporter, they might say, "Oh, well, I covered that story on IHSS next week." You need to be prepared to really make the case that there's a side that hasn't yet been presented. Similarly, the time of day that you have an event can really determine whether you get any coverage there. For example, many TV reporters have to prepare their story and send it in by the middle of the afternoon, unless it's really something that's urgent breaking news. So if you have an event at 4 p.m., when reporters are getting ready to put their stories together for the 5 o'clock news, oftentimes you're not going to get any turnout. Similarly with print reporters, so you want oftentimes the late morning will be a better time of day to have an event than, say, the mid-afternoon. And then the location. Typically you want to make it as easy as possible for reporters to turn out to your event. As we said, folks are obviously stretched very thin, and you want to make sure that you don't put too many hurdles in the way of them turning out to the event. And then lastly, visuals and signage. We talked about this before. You want to be able to really present your picture in a snapshot. So think about whether you have kind of an interesting backdrop or interesting signage that really conveys your message. And that's important because, as I said, folks are having events like at the Capitol almost every day. And so reporters are looking for something that looks a little bit different oftentimes so that all of their stories don't have kind of the same backdrop. So I'm going to go on to slide 21. And this just goes back to some of the other things that we talked about just in terms of being prepared when you're speaking to reporters. Make sure you understand kind of what's already been written. Think through, if you were the reporter, what questions would you ask? And then make sure that you have those answers ready to go. And we'll go on to slide 22. This is again just in terms of the interviews. Oftentimes when you speak to a reporter, maybe the next day you open the newspaper and the quote that's attributed to you maybe isn't the message that you wanted to convey. And I think 9 times out of 10 that's because a reporter will ask you a question and then you'll go into explaining it, sometimes maybe get sidetracked. So it's really important to really stay on your message. It's why it's good to have it written out ahead of time. And if you don't know the answer to a question, or if it is kind of a long, complicated answer, you might want to tell the reporter that you want to go in background to explain that, because you want to give them the background on the issue from your perspective, but you don't necessarily want all of that explanation to be the message that's presented in the paper. You want the quote that's attributed to you to be exactly what's on your message, and we'll talk later about what that message will be. And then the last slide in this section is just on social media. A lot of people are are doing this now. A lot of folks have a Twitter account or a Facebook account. Let's do a quick survey with raising your hand on the webinar. How many people are using Twitter, or your organization is using Twitter? A show of hands. We got one person. Sherry Burns is using Twitter. Kim is using Twitter. So we've got at least a couple of people. And Twitter, I think, is actually a great practice for making your message concise. Because if you can explain an issue, explain your position on an issue, motivate people to take action in 160 words, or 160 characters, excuse me, then you're far ahead of the game in terms of creating a really short and succinct and clear message. But of course, the same rules apply to all of the media. You want to obviously stay on your message and remember your audience, which is something we're going to talk about more in the messaging section too. And I'm going to switch to the next section here, which is on creating the message. And I'll ask again if there are any questions. I know I still have one in the queue that I want to get back to after we talk about messaging a little more in depth, and that one's from Kim. But are there any other questions? Okay, I don't see any more questions, so I'll go ahead and someone did ask a question, which is what is on background when it comes to speaking to reporters? And what that means, you'll often hear on TV or in the movies sometimes, people will say they'll go off the record or on background. And it's a great question because it's important to know what those two words mean. On background means that you are explaining an issue to a reporter with the permission that they can print it, but not to attribute it to you. And if you're an expert on an issue and you're okay being quoted on an issue, it's fine to speak to the reporter what's called on the record, where they can print everything in the paper and put quotes around it and say that it's from you. But oftentimes as advocates, we don't want our message necessarily to be the 10-year history of an issue. We want our message to be this is the action we need and this is why it's needed. So that's why we want to be clear about being on the record versus on background. And then off the record would mean that you're giving a reporter some information, but you don't want it attributed to you. So that means the reporter would have to kind of go and verify that information and then attribute it to someone else. So obviously, we only want to give factual information, and we want to build trust with the media that we're giving good information. But on background is a method you can use to make sure that when you are quoted on an issue, it's just on your message, and you can give all of the background when you say, I'm going to go on background. So it's often good to just tell the reporter up front that you'll answer all their questions on background, but in terms of the quote that's printed in their story and that has your name attached, that you want to be clear that that's when you're using your message points. Okay, so now we're on to the next session, which is crafting the message. So I hope that the previous section was kind of a good refresher in terms of working with the media, or for folks that haven't done media work, a good introduction. And like I said, I'll be giving my contact information at the end, and if people have more questions as you are maybe putting on an event or working on a particular issue, you can feel free to shoot me an email. The next section here is really, we've talked about what are the methods that we use to get our message out, and now we're talking about what it is that we're saying. So I'm on slide 25 now. Creating a powerful message. And really, like we talked about before, your message should really be simple and to the point. It should include a description of the problem that you're trying to solve. It should point to the solution that you want to see, and it should describe very clearly what's the action that needs to be taken to make sure that solution is implemented. And we want to be careful when we are creating our, whether it's your set of talking points, it's your message, whether it's putting your message on your website or writing a press release or writing an op-ed, that we avoid jargon. And that, I think, is one of the really important issues I want to underscore, is that when we're communicating with the media, when we're writing a press release, when we're putting information out in the public, we really want to think about understanding the issue that we're talking about, understanding the action that we want to see from the perspective of someone who isn't an expert in our field. There's a lot of, oftentimes, words that we'll throw around that make sense when we're talking about them in the workplace, when we're talking to our colleagues, when we're talking to our friends that work in the advocacy community, but we don't necessarily, they might not be well understood by people who don't have our same job or work in our same community. So that's something we'll talk about. We're going to look at some samples a little bit later, and I'm going to ask you to kind of pick out some of the jargon and think about ways to present it in a way that folks will understand if they're not familiar with our issue. Because a lot of times we're presenting messages to the media because we want people to take action. For example, someone who isn't necessarily familiar with our issue, but they open up the newspaper and they read a story and they say, absolutely, that's a policy that makes sense, and I want my legislator to support it. And so to really motivate people that are outside our circles and expand our coalitions, it's important that we think about approaching them with language that they understand. So the next couple of slides, I'm on slide 26 now. The next couple of slides really describe what I would call kind of the old thinking about messaging, and then talk about the new thinking that advocates are using right now, and that our folks are doing research around. And the old way, if you think about a lot of, for example, political campaigns, are really centered around this kind of messaging that is conflict driven. It'll be messaging that points to a particular person, or points to a particular political party, or points to an opponent on the other side of an issue and says, these people are to blame for this situation. It's these people that are being bad actors, and that's why the rest of us are feeling the consequences. And obviously, a lot of people that put political ads on TV, a lot of people that are still doing communications. You might hear elected officials on the TV that are still using this kind of messaging, and obviously they think it's effective, or they wouldn't be doing it. But if you'll flip to the next slide, 27, there are some progressive groups that have done a lot of research on what's a more effective way to communicate, because their experience is that that kind of rhetoric and that kind of conflict-driven messaging isn't really taking our policy in the direction that we want to go. And so these are organizations like the Demos Foundation, the SCAN Foundation, and whereas the old kind of messaging has really been driven by by polling, by taking a snapshot of what people think about an issue right now, and then thinking about what is the way to use that information to drive the decision that we want in the short term. These groups are really digging a little bit deeper, doing more kind of qualitative research, and really thinking more about the long-term horizon versus kind of what are the few buzzwords that we can use to motivate a person around a decision right now. They're really looking at the kind of messaging that over the long term changes the way people think about government, about services that are important to our communities, and about particularly about funding those. So their messaging is really focused on looking for what are the shared values, putting aside kind of partisan labels, putting aside traditional views of one party being for government and more supportive of government services, and then kind of pointing the finger at another party. And their findings are really that kind of heated rhetoric turns people off. When we want to be engaging more people in talking positively about services that are important to people with disabilities, to low-income communities, to people of color in particular, that oftentimes when you approach the average person on the street, they are so kind of fed up with people pointing fingers at each other that their tendency is to just turn off those messages. And so the DMOS Foundation, the SCAN Foundation are looking for messages that really focus on shared priorities and values versus being divisive between political party. So we're going to take a look at some of those words and some of those messages later. But I wanted to present kind of the old way versus the new way because I think that in terms of Olmstead and some of the policies that folks are wanting to implement over the long term and changing the way that people think about funding those services through taxes, for example, that's really more of a long-term message and a long-term campaign to change people's minds about government, about services, and about funding those to provide opportunity for everyone. But we need to acknowledge kind of the challenge, which is that in a lot of ways the media, as we talked about, is looking for conflict when they're covering an event. They're looking for to provide kind of a clear contrast on who's on what side. And so this new messaging doesn't really fit into the model a lot of times that the media is looking for. And so I think our challenge is really going to be creating messaging that is useful to us in convincing policymakers on issues and in broadening our networks in terms of getting policy changes. But we need to also be mindful that we're going to have to be really kind of creative in putting on events and creative in the ways that attract media to cover our issues so that we can have the opportunity to get our message out. So I hope that makes sense. So I'm going to go to slide 28 now. So this is where I'm hoping folks will will participate, and I want to look at some messages, and these are actual quotes that appeared in newspapers and in news stories on disability issues. And so I want to just kind of set some ground rules that the people who said these things might very well be on this call. So I don't want to critique people necessarily, but I do want to look for opportunities where we can say this is a good message, and when we can say maybe an aspect of a message could be changed or something can be better explained. And I'm hoping that kind of by looking at a few different messages, it'll be helpful when we come to the part where we're going to create our own message. So I want to start with, this is on slide 28 that says comparing messages activity. And I'll read this one, and then I'm hoping that people will raise their hand to speak or put a message in the chat window about what is good about this message and what we think can be improved. So I'm going to start, I'll read the first one here. A lot of people think that disability is a tragedy or a barrier to be overcome, but we are here today to say that people with disabilities are beautiful just the way we are. We don't need to be cured, fixed, cleaned, or anything else. We are disabled and proud and beautiful. So let's think about, if you open the newspaper and you saw a story about an event. This is actually a message that was in a story about a disability pride parade in San Jose recently. So think about, let's give some feedback about what we like about this message and what could be improved. Does anybody want to, oh, I see a message in the chat window. I know we do hear people with multiple sclerosis say all the time, we want a cure. So that is maybe something we need to be mindful of, that folks, 100% of people might not necessarily agree with this message. In terms of if you were someone who just opened up their newspaper on a Saturday morning and you're reading this along with your cup of coffee, what would this message make you think about? And Cheryl says it would be thought-provoking.
If you're on the phone and have a comment, just press *6 to unmute your line.
So do you think that the person reading it might feel like they were sort of being criticized when they didn't really understand the issues? If they, if they're not really part of the debate?
Right. It could be, we're obviously taking these out a little bit out of context, so we don't necessarily know what the whole story was. Like I said, this was kind of a pride parade, so I think the message that the advocates were really trying to convey here is that people with disabilities don't need to be ashamed, and that we're really people like everyone else in the community that is trying to to contribute, etc. So
this is Michael in San Diego.
Hi.
I think it's a positive message, but it might make a lot of people think that the community doesn't need any assistance.
Right. Okay. So that's a good. So that's a good comment. And Sherry typed in that it's provocative. But it's a positive message, and that if you read the introduction that this is from a person with a disability, that you might take it a little bit differently. So that's just it's a little bit of something to think about when we're creating our messages. So the next one, this is slide 29, says we want to remind politicians that people with disabilities, more than any other sector of society, are heavily reliant on the state for supports and services. Any further cuts to incomes and services would have a hugely detrimental impact on the lives of people with disabilities and their families. Do people have reactions to this one?
This is Alice from Cleveland. I'm thinking that maybe you don't want to remind them that we're heavily reliant on the state for supports and services in one way. And another way we do want, because we want them to not to cut funding. So I think it could go either way. And I don't know what was this story about, or what was the rest of it?
Right. I think that this was a story about budget issues, okay. And that people feel like there have already been so many budget cuts, and we just can't take any more. Mm-hmm. So this is, this is a challenge that we often have, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later. But I've heard from advocates in the disability community that oftentimes in the media, people with disabilities are presented either as sort of tragic, that folks don't have control over their lives, that they are kind of subject to decisions that are made that they're not involved in, or that they're presented as kind of heroic figures that have overcome a lot of difficulty. And I think a lot of folks feel that most people with disabilities are maybe somewhere in the middle, that they're they're people who go to work, go to school, have don't really fit into either of those two boxes. And so this is a challenge in terms of our messaging too, that we want to be strong and be strong advocates, and not give a perception that that we're going to accept decisions without having input in them. But then we also need to advocate for funding and for services and support. So this is another kind of thought-provoking.
Politicians too want to know whether they're thinking about whether it's cost effective, so somehow we could throw that.
Right.
That could be thrown into the discussion there, and I think it would help.
Great. Let's see, and this is the third one that I'll read. By eliminating the program instead of cutting back, and I think this was a story about IHSS, but I think the kind of the larger issue will apply to a number of different policies. But by eliminating the program instead of cutting back, they don't necessarily violate Medicaid law, but it will violate Americans with Disabilities Act. It's really a misguided and illegal attempt to cut services to people who need them to avoid being put into nursing homes. Do people have thoughts on this one? My comment on this one as a person who isn't an expert in Medicaid law or the Americans with Disabilities Act is that this isn't really a good message in terms of a public message. This might be a message you want to use inside the legislator when you're talking to elected officials or whatnot. But most people don't know what the Medicaid law is, and many people sadly probably don't know what the Americans with Disabilities Act is. So in terms of just for the average person opening this and reading their newspaper, this probably might confuse them more than anything. So I think we just need to be mindful that when we're communicating in the public and through the media, that that we want to be a little bit more clear about the problem and the action that's needed in without using the kind of jargon. And the last one says, this is slide 31, people with disabilities are also people with extraordinary talent, yet they are too often forgotten. When people with disabilities are denied opportunities, they're more likely to fall into poverty, and people living in conditions of poverty are more likely to develop disabilities. As long as societies exclude those with disabilities, they will not reach their full potential, and the poor in particular will be denied opportunities that they deserve. Any thoughts on this one? And Cheryl has asked, what is the purpose of this message? And someone else commented, it seems to be a mixed message. One is that folks have extraordinary talent, but then they're being maybe excluded. So this one I think is good in terms of it uses language that anyone can understand. And it does make the argument more generally about what if you're a person who doesn't have a disability, why should you care about disability issues? So it is a little bit maybe long and more complicated than it needs to be, not as sharp as it could be. But I think it's good in the fact that it talks about kind of the shared values, the shared purpose, that the reason that when people don't have support, that it really affects our whole society. So that's one thing I kind of liked about this one. So I want to go into, this is on slide 32, messaging tips. And this, I want to give credit here to those organizations we talked about before, the Demos Foundation and the SCAN Foundation. And these, these are really kind of rules to live by in messaging. And we had talked about this before, avoiding overheated rhetoric, don't reinforce bad frames. And that, that really means that oftentimes it's, people are looking for kind of dramatic statements about, if a program isn't supported, there's going to be a catastrophe. That that people kind of turn off those really strong messages, and then in terms of the framing, that people have in their mind certain preconceptions when it comes to government and services. One is that it's all kind of political, insider, and then that the decisions made don't really make a difference because the whole system is broken. One might be that there are people who pay taxes, and then there are people who get services, and they're not necessarily the same people. So there are kind of givers and there are takers, and these are kind of generalizations people have in their mind, and when you want to talk to them about a government program or a service, that they kind of have these negative images, and we don't want to reinforce those. And then we talked about jargon that we don't want to use. And then what we do want to do is, again, think about things from the perspective of the audience. So, I think a good way to think about this is when you're going to do a media interview or write an op-ed, for example, you want to explain things almost in a way if you were explaining them to a person who just came to California from another state or just came from another country, and doesn't have a preconceived notion about how things work, how they how services should work. Really almost want to think about it from the perspective of a lay person, and that's going to really help avoid some of those jargon and technical issues that folks might not understand, and will help you phrase things in a way that don't reinforce those bad frames. And so then the next few items here are from the SCAN Foundation, which has done some research in this area and some surveys in terms of particular words that resonate as we're talking about disability issues. And those are talk about what people want from an improved system of care, not what they don't want. So we want to phrase things in a positive way. What are we looking forward to? What is the point that we're driving toward? Next, focus on core values, independence, financial security, choice, health, and wellness. And lastly, use effective words and phrases such as dignity, community, active, affordable options, and network of healthcare and supportive services. So those are all things to be mindful of when we go into our messaging exercise. So does anyone have any questions now? We're going to spend the last 20 minutes or so on the message activity, and hopefully people aren't too tired. It's been a long call so far. But if people have questions that they want to have answered.
I think you've done a good job of asking questions along the way. Seems like people are following along.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and okay, so we're now on slide 33, the message triangle. And this is just, I think, a simple tool that I hope people will use. Some of you may use it in your organizations already. And it's just a way to sort of organize your thoughts and really help you hone in on a simple message. And I don't know if any of you participated in a workshop we did in January in San Diego with the Systems Change Network. But we spent a good amount of time going over this message triangle. And at the end, I'll show you kind of what the product was that the group put together. But we'll go ahead and kind of go through the steps now. And again, this is just a simple way to organize your message or getting ready for an advocacy effort on a particular policy, whether you're getting ready to do an event around an issue. And it really, the triangle comes into play because we're going to have a central message that conveys the elements we talked about earlier, the solution that we're looking for, the action that we need to achieve that solution, and then the broadly shared benefit and values. And then each leg of the triangle will have 3 supporting points that answer the questions. Why the solution, and why this action is needed, and what the broadly shared benefit and values are. So on the next slide, 34 is the message triangle. And this is also the worksheet that Laurel pointed you to earlier, and I think maybe emailed out earlier. And so I'm hoping that that we can go through this together, and then at the end I'll show you one that is completed. So when it comes to Olmstead, I'm going to look for your suggestions here about what are particular policy outcomes that folks are working on. I know a lot of people are working on different issues. But since we're talking about Olmstead, that I'd ask for suggestions from the group about what's a particular policy that people are working on, what's an issue that you're trying to bring awareness to, or a policy that you're trying to get adopted. And I'll look for your suggestions in the chat window or on the over the phone if people are using that method. And I see here keeping people in the community, DSLC housing, and then Laurel suggested the importance of housing to transitioning people out of institutions. So I'm thinking that's probably maybe a related issue. So let's take that one, the importance of housing to transition people out of institutions. And if everyone has their triangle in front of them, we want to develop a central message and then 3 points to support why that policy is needed. So we're talking about affordable housing and why that's needed to transition people out of institutions. So the way I always like to start this is to think about for people who are not part of the disability community, what would you say to them to make the point that this is an issue they should be interested in? Does anybody want to suggest something over the phone or via the chat window? And Joey Riley says it's cheaper, so it's more cost effective to house people in or to provide affordable housing than to house them in an institution. So, so cost is one of the points. Oh, someone's filling this in. Must be Laurel. It's like magic. So it looks like someone's filling in the triangle on the screen there. Let's see. Nancy Hall says there's not enough housing. So there's an availability issue. So that really gets at kind of what is the solution that we need, which is a greater supply of affordable housing. So that's going to be in the center probably, because that's that's the solution that we're looking for. Any other suggestions from the phone or the screen? Right to self-determination. So that's about choice, right? That's a word that we saw earlier on the SCAN Foundation list of words that resonate when we're talking about these issues with the public. Laurel says in 13 California housing markets, it would take more than a person's whole SSI check, their total income, just to rent an apartment. So that's really definitely a supporting fact, is that we need support for a housing system because it's not.
Please do your homework. You don't need me.
Alan, I think it's time to mute the phones again.
Yeah, there's someone on the line that needs to mute their line. Let me try.
And Joey says there's a better quality of life.
Tell me, Mom. Go. Come on,
So let's talk about, for folks that are working on housing, what is the action that we're looking to be taken to make it possible for people to choose housing outside of an
All attendees have been muted.
increase the affordable housing stock and use federal funds to create more housing vouchers and universal design. So that's something we're going to want to put in we had talked about in our central message box, that we want to talk about what's the solution. So it sounds like the solutions are more housing vouchers is a specific solution. And maybe there are other solutions that we can always you can always make more message triangles. So who do we need to take this action? To provide more federal funds, and to increase the affordable housing stock. Who do we want to take that action? And Joey says HUD. Great. And our state government. So we want to go over, I'm just going to kind of recap what are the elements we said of our central message, or the solution that's needed, and we're, for the time being, I think just going to choose one, which is additional housing vouchers. We need the federal and state government to take an active role in supporting that policy. And thirdly, we want to talk about what's the broadly shared benefit. And I think we talked about that as choice, choice and cost effectiveness. city government also, not just county government. Okay, so I think probably maybe everyone's taking notes on their triangle here, and so I think we've decided that our central message is that choice in where we live is a shared priority. That's something that we talked about in terms of that's a message that that resonates with everyone. That everyone expects to have choice in where they can live. And what we need is for our city, state, and federal government to take action to increase the availability of affordable housing. Through, I heard a few suggestions, vouchers, support for modifying the housing stock for accessibility. And maybe that's it. And then, so that's our message, and that's we can something that people can play with in terms of putting in words that they're comfortable with. But I think we know what the elements of those are going to be. That choice is important, that it benefits our whole community when everyone can choose where they live and participate in the community. And then I think we have we know who we want to make accountable for that. Leaders at every level of government, and then we know what the solutions are that we're looking for, the modifications in the housing, the vouchers to make it more affordable, et cetera. And so then the supporting points we heard were that it's more cost effective for everyone because institutionalization is expensive. And then I saw another point that we could put in our other supporting point box there, that without support, people are at risk of reinstitutionalization, and that has associated costs. So you can kind of see that the way that you would do this for whatever issue, you're sure that your central message has those elements, and that you have points to support them. So when you are, you can use this triangle exercise when you're, writing talking points. If you're going to go and make a presentation at your city council meeting, for example, you can use it as a tool when you're going to go into an interview, and this will just really kind of help you organize your central message and then your supporting points, and then if you have specific facts, as Laurel mentioned about the SSI check not covering rent in most places. And so this is something that you can do on your own. You can always go back to that triangle, and you can use it, modify it wherever you might be speaking, wherever you might be doing an interview. For example, if you were going to go speak in front of a religious group, for example, you might want to have your supporting points be about the value of people coming together and the values of that faith in terms of supporting those programs. That everyone should share in the cost of supporting people in our community. So with that, this is a kind of an exercise we could spend all day on, but I hope that as people kind of took notes on their own triangle, or that we can send this out via email or another method, that you can use it as a tool to think about what are the elements of your message, and then what are the supporting points for each of those. So I'm going to flip ahead now to the next slide, which is a completed message triangle. And this is something that we put together. Like I said, this is just kind of a recap of a similar exercise that we did in San Diego with maybe some of the folks who are on this call, but other folks from the Systems Change Network. And the tag is a little small, so I'll read it. But this was kind of a general message about Olmstead and community living. And the central message that we developed was the freedom for each person to make their own choice about where and how to live is a fundamental part of the American dream. And that goes back to the point we talked about, that we want to relate our message to kind of the shared values that everyone has, so that we are broadening the number of people that our message is appealing to. And then the next part of that central message is it's time for all of us to come together and hold our elected leaders accountable for making the policy and budgetary decisions necessary to make community living a reality for people with disabilities. So again, we're talking about we need policy changes, and we need the budget that supports community living and makes it not just a law in the books, but really a reality for people with disabilities. And then you'll see the supporting points. One of them was people with disabilities are a broad group of people in our society. They are young, they're old, they are parents, they are children, and that each one of them has a value to our community, and that all of our community life is enriched for all of us when each person can participate in school, in the workplace, and in community life. And then our second point was about the cost that someone brought up earlier. That an institutional setting is more costly to taxpayers. And then we had a fact that supported that nursing home care can cost 6 to 8 times as much as support for community living. And then lastly, that that Olmstead isn't something new. This is the law, and it's has been affirmed by the court. So we're not introducing a new policy. This isn't a new direction. It's a direction that has already been settled, and it's one we need to work toward. So we have just a few minutes left, I think, and I'm happy to take questions. I know someone asked a question earlier, and I'm hoping maybe I can follow up with that person online, because I think it's pretty specific, and maybe and that is Kim. So I'm going to ask Laurel to help me connect with you after the fact, because I think you have a really good question, but I want to kind of understand it a little bit better offline, if that's okay. And then the last couple of slides, I just want to leave these with you as a resource in terms of questions that we often get about working with the media and events. And I will I'm just going to leave them with you because I think we've kind of talked about all of those, but I want to leave them with you in terms of just a resource for you to come back to. So, oops, I skipped too far ahead. So I'm going to skip to slide 40 and give you my contact information, and then I'm going to let Laurel take it from here.
Thank you so much, Nikki. That was wonderful. So this is Nikki's contact information for her public affairs communications firm. Her partner is Mike Roth, and we work with them quite a lot. So you can reach her there, and I follow them on Twitter, and you might enjoy doing that as well. And really, those of you who've done this before know the drill, that after we're done here, when you
All attendees have been unmuted.
When you close out, you'll get the automatic evaluation. Please do take 5 minutes and fill out that evaluation. It helps us with our ongoing webinars and especially any technical problems. I see a couple of, thank you very much, Joey, for the applause. You can follow Californians for Olmstead. Oh, this training, I should say, will be posted on our website and under training materials where I took you at the beginning of this, and you can access it there. You can also access the previous 4 webinars so you can get the entire picture. And you can follow us on Facebook on Californians for Olmstead. And so I think Cheryl has a question, and if you are mute, you can type it in the chat box, but we'll just take your last question, Cheryl. Oh, she doesn't. We have a little technological ghost in the chat box. Thank you all so much for participating today. Thank you to Nikki for sharing your expertise and your thoughtfulness. I really like this message triangle that the Systems Change Network came up with. I think there's just a lot of in this process you took us through, there's a lot of nuance, and it really, going through the process really clarifies a very clear message, which I think was your intention, and I really appreciate all of your expertise and your time in putting this training together for us. This is the end of our final webinar. Do check them out online, recommend them to your friends, and look for whatever kind of webinars we come up with next. We'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.